November 1836. Finally, it's done. I've sold my half of Vandraven and Morrison to my old partner and friend, Robert Morrison. He's now the proud owner of 20 of the finest clipper ships to ever sail from Southampton. May they serve him well in his future endeavors. As for myself, I am content. My new wife is young, beautiful, and the daughter of a wealthy planter well established in the Jamaicas. Her heritage is old, almost as old as my own, if not quite as prestigious. Accompanying her is a maid, Matilda, a wild creature of mixed heritage. Dusk beauty indeed, who never leaves my wife's side. I believe my manservant, Stephen, is already in love. We count ourselves lucky to have such glorious company as we undertake the long voyage back to England. December 1836. The new house is a marvel. Sat atop a rearing cliff, it overlooks the dark waves of the Atlantic and the picturesque village of Mavaghazi, which sits nestled on the southern coast of windswept Cornwall. On our arrival, we were greeted by Jonathan Wills, builder and architect, who I had, at some expense, commissioned to build the house. After some pleasant trivialities, he took me gently to one side and explained to me some of the extra cost I had incurred during my long absence. Most of these seemed to revolve around compensatory-like matters, as it seemed 2 workers, both men from the village, had died whilst working on the house. One had died after falling from the scaffolding, and the other crushed to death by falling masonry from faulty rigging. Now, I inquired of Wills how this was any concern of mine. After all, the men had been hired legally and paid an honest day's wage for an honest day's labor. Any misfortune that had befallen them through accident, act of God, or their own carelessness was no concern of mine. It was at this point that I first learned of the village's dislike of not only myself, but also that of my new home. Wills informed me, in no uncertain terms, that it would be in my best interest and a gesture of goodwill if I was to compensate the grieving widows of both men. After some little thought, I agreed on the condition that he tell me what grievances the village and its denizens had against myself and my new home. He agreed and commenced with telling of his tale. According to Wills, the ground upon which my new house stood was considered by many of the villagers, and others here, and about the general area, as something akin to sacred ground. Something to do with an ancient druid grove and a great circle of stone rings, both of which had been uprooted and destroyed to make room for my new home. The great stones themselves smashed and used in the very foundation of the house itself. This and more he told me until I could contain myself no longer and laughed uproariously in the poor man's face. After some small while I regained my composure and I apologized profusely for my rudeness, all the while explaining that the local fairy tales bothered me not at all, and the opinions of us, a bunch of superstitious locals, bothered me even less. But still, I had to live in this place and do business with the local shopkeepers and merchants, and so I sent Wills on his way with a heavy purse with which to compensate the grieving families of the 2 men. January 1837. Christmas was something of a muted affair. Many of my old friends and acquaintances are situated in London, and we are quite alone here in our own little corner of the world. My wife does not partake of strong drink, as is becoming of a lady. Now, she was somewhat silent and sullen through the whole affair. As for her maid, Matilda, she would not even acknowledge the sacred holiday at all, and I fear she's no true Christian. I stayed up late that night and drank deeply, lonely in my solitude. I even went so far as to drag my poor manservant Stevens from his warm bed before plying him liberally with generous amounts of my finest brandy. We sat there some time before a roaring fire, talking over old times while the wind howled and gibbered outside our window. The last thing I heard as I fell asleep was the roar of the ocean. I did not dream. March 1837. It's been 4 months and 3 days since we moved into the house, and although I have taken my beautiful Elizabeth to bed every night and performed my husbandly duties with great vim and vigor, there's no sign of a child. My beloved tells me these things take time, but I find myself growing more sullen, spending more and more time locked in my study poring over my old ledgers. My wife is strong, young, beautiful, and almost 20 years my junior. I feel our troubles stem from myself, for I have grown old in many years of business, and now I fear shall never sire an heir to continue the sacred name of Vandraven. God save me from such a fate. April 1837. The doctor I sent for arrived only yesterday, and after a lengthy examination of both myself and Elizabeth, and after many searching questions, deemed us both fit and healthy, and could see no reason why children should not be forthcoming in our immediate future. September 1837. The summer was a glorious one, and I had almost forgotten this journal. Our days have been spent frolicking on the local beaches, where we picnicked and swam frequently in the chilly Cornish sea. Our nights spent sipping wine on the veranda, listening to the gentle laughing of the surrounding sea, but for all our happiness and our nightly devotions to one another, there is still no sign of a child. October 1837. God forgive me, for I have sinned. I have drank of vile potions, and I've prayed to dark gods, offering up sacrifice for their favor. It all started with that Witch Matilda, who one evening, long after my wife had retired to her bed, approached me where I sat reading by lamplight in my study. She entered silently, and I only noticed her presence when she laid a dusky hand upon my shoulder, causing me to cry out and spill my drink on the book that I had been reading. Leaping to my feet, I cursed her roundly. She took a step back before my anger and curtsied, casting her eyes down demurringly. Yet still it seemed a small smile played across her shapely lips. I demanded she explain why she was sneaking around the house at this ungodly hour instead of attending her mistress, my good lady wife. She informed her mistress was abed and sleeping soundly, and it was now me she intended to serve. Now, baffled, I asked her meaning, but her next question caught me off guard. She asked how badly I wanted a child. And a male one, at that. An heir to carry on the Vandraven bloodline. For a moment I was tempted to beat her for her insolence, and even raised my hand to do so, but something in her eyes stilled my hand, causing it to drop limply by my side. Anything, I answered. I would do almost anything for a male heir to carry on the Vandraven name. Nodding, she took my hand, and I marveled at how soft her skin was against my own, as she led me from my study through the kitchen and down the darkened cellar. God, how to describe what waited for me deep in the bowels of my own home. An altar anointed with blood, a sacrifice to some dark and terrible god. Everywhere candles burned, flickering in the eyes of the dead animals that lay all about. Pigeons, doves, cats, even a large black dog lay piled around its base, their blood soaking into the feet of that terrible statue that sat hunched and grotesque. An insult to those of us who dwell in the sane light of day. Its body, while hunched and twisted, resembled that of a man. But that's where anything human in likeness suddenly stopped, for its head was that of a great octopus, scaled with huge, staring eyes, and a mass of withered tentacles covering the lower half of its face. From its gnarled back sprung stunted wings, and its scaled arms and feet were claw-like and webbed. I turned to run, to flee this abomination, but the Witch Matilda stood blocking my way. I tried to push past, but she grabbed my arm and spun me back around to face her, blowing some kind of noxious dust in my face that instantly caused my head to pound and sent my senses reeling. The next thing I knew, we were both naked, kneeling before the bloody altar. The knife was in my hand. God. Oh, God. Stevens lay dead before me. His throat, a red ruin, his hot blood all over me. Beside me knelt Matilda, chanting, her naked body covered in sweat and blood, as she cried out her devotion to her infernal gods. I tried to rise, but she pushed me back down upon my back and climbed on top of me. From behind her, she pulled a small wooden bowl brimming with some kind of noxious liquid, which she raised to her lips. Taking the potion into her mouth, she pressed her lips against my own, but I twisted my head to and fro, raising my hands to beat her off, but she caught them easily and placed them upon her heavy breast, letting some of the crimson potion trickle from between her ripe lips down over her heavy, glistening body. In a moment, her lips crushed against mine, spilling the vile poison down my throat. The rest of the night was filled with blurred images as we fornicated amongst the dead, like wild animals biting and tearing at each other, and I, filled with all the vigor of my youth. Until at last I collapsed exhausted, only to awake the very next day battered and bruised in my own bed. So exhausted I was, barely able to move. I called out, and my cry was instantly heeded as a smiling Elizabeth entered the room, carrying a tray as if she had been waiting just outside the door. She asked me how I was feeling as she placed the tray across my lap and told me how they had found me sweating and delirious upon my study floor in the grip of some strange fever. I tried to speak to tell her of the horror, but I only managed a single word. Stevens. Smiling, she patted my hand. Her next words turned my blood cold. Sick, she lied, smiling all the while. Down with the same fever as your own, my love. But don't worry, she said, beginning to spoon-feed me a strange-tasting broth. It will all be over soon. November 1837. Days have passed, maybe even weeks. I am a prisoner laying here in this filthy bed, drugged and alone, only this journal to bear witness to my plight. The Witch Matilda came to visit me yesterday, her belly already round and swollen. She took my hand and placed it on her stomach. What a fine son I will have, she grinned. A fine boy who will have a fine name and a fine fortune. A vessel for my master. For now his time has come round once again, and he will walk abroad once more in the land of men. And they will tremble at his coming, for the sleeper has awoken Lucas Vandraven. She stroked my brow almost affectionately. And he will be of one father and two mothers, as it is written in the dark pages of time. I could do nothing but lay there and listen to her ramblings, as she spoon-fed me the intoxicating broth down my throat, her soft chanting lulling me into a drug-fueled sleep. I awoke sometime later in the dark. Perhaps only hours had passed, or even days. It's so hard to keep track of time in this place. The last face I remembered seeing was that of my once beloved Elizabeth, who sat silently by my side, spooning scalding broth between my lips, sometimes to smile at whatever little pain she could cause me. How glad I will be when you are dead, she said, ramming the spoon down my throat until I started to gag and choke. All those nights with your shriveled old body, sweating on me, grunting. How I shuddered at your touch, and still, you couldn't give me a child. Now Matilda has the honor of bringing our master into this world, but he is strong I will need 2 mothers, and I will feel his sacred touch. Feel him growing inside of me, and after, when he is born into this world, I will come for you, Marcus Vandraven." She raised and threw back the scalding covers from my wasted body. She poured the remainder of the scalding broth onto my lap and laughed down at me, where I withered in agony before mercifully passing out. Later, I felt a cold hand pressed against my throat as I swam up through the darkness. "He is alive," the voice of Matilda chimed. "You gave him too large a dose is all. That and the pain you have inflicted upon him." "Why do we bother?" Elizabeth replied. "Let's just kill him and have done with it." "Be silent, you fool," Matilda snapped. "We still may have need for him. Should the ceremony go wrong, we will have to start the whole process all over again." "Starting again." Elizabeth's voice sounded worried. "As he is now, he can barely move, let alone give you another vessel for the master." Matilda laughed a throaty chuckle. "I have potions that can rouse a dead man's passions. Have no fear of that. If all goes well tomorrow night, we shall have no more use for him, and you can kill him yourself. But until that time, leave him alone. No more of your little games." "You promise?" she asked, their voices moving away. "That I can kill him?" Faded now as they closed the door gently behind them. I knew then that I must find a way to stop them. Not only for myself, but also to prevent whatever evil they intended to bring into this world. God, I pray, give me strength. This will be my last entry in this journal. I awoke this very night to the roar of thunder and the flash of lightning outside my window. Seemed I'd slept the entire day away, uninterrupted, and I felt somewhat better for that. Faded was the leaden feel in my limbs, and my mind felt clear and sharp for the first time in many days. It seemed Elizabeth had heeded the Witch Matilda's words and had left me alone, or perhaps they were busy with whatever evil they were planning, and they'd forgotten about me. Either way, my prayers had been answered, and I felt stronger than I had in days. Now free from the effects of whatever terrible drug they had been feeding me. Rousing myself, I sat up, wincing at the stiffness in my limbs as I slowly rose to my feet, leaning against the bedpost as a wave of dizziness assaulted my senses. After a few deep breaths, the room stopped its spinning and I was able to gather my senses about me once again. Staggering over to my dresser, I quickly dressed before heading to the door. My hand had just started to turn the handle when the chanting started, and suddenly the air felt charged with electricity, making it hard to breathe, causing my scalp to tighten and the skin of my arm to crawl with great knots of goose flesh. For a moment I considered running, leaving this place for the damn forever. But I could not. Whatever evil was afoot, I had played my part in it. For was it not my very essence that was being used, manipulated to bring something unspeakable into the world? Strengthening my resolve, I took a deep breath and I threw open the door, expecting to be greeted by all the denizens of hell, but there was only a darkened corridor lit by flashes of lightning, crash of thunder that seemed to accompany the hellish chanting like some terrible drum. The air felt thick and heavy as I continued on down the hall, past the library and drawing room, till at last I stopped outside my wife's dressing room and, with trembling hands, threw open the door. They were both there, lying upon the floor, facing each other, completely naked, their legs splayed wide open, their ankles entwined. The room was lit by hundreds of candles, and there was blood everywhere. It lay in puddles upon the hardwood floor and ran in rivulets down the walls. Even the ceiling dripped with a crimson rain, splashing and hissing against the burning candles, splattering and showering the 2 chanting women. I watched on in horror as Matilda's ripe stomach started to heave and twist, She had time to let out a single ear-piercing shriek before her stomach suddenly exploded, bathing Elizabeth's lower half in blood and gore as the creature inside her clawed and heaved its way out. I let out a wail of despair as the creature more fully emerged, for I had seen this thing before, carved in stone deep in the bowels of my own home. For this was Matilda's dark god brought to life by our terrible union. At the sound of my cry, Elizabeth noticed my presence for the first time, raised her blood-covered face and hissed at me, her eyes filled with hatred as if daring me to come closer. Now the creature was free and slowly crawling towards her waiting flesh. A laborious umbilical cord trailing behind it, eager to be in its new host, hidden away from the world where it could continue to grow and consolidate its power. Quickly, I looked for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell upon a basket full of knitting. With a cry of triumph, I leapt forward and snatched up 2 slender wooden needles and ran across the room, but it was too late. It was too late. The creature was gone, hidden away, buried deep inside of my once beloved Elizabeth. Only the trailing umbilical cord remained. Steeling myself, I made a grab for it, snatching it up. At once my skin began to burn and blistered where the thing twisted and writhed in my hand. With a cry of fear and outrage, I heaved with all of my might, aborting the hateful thing back into the world. I did not stop or even think, but thrust the wooden needles down, driving them deep through the creature's strange flesh, pinning it in place. It let out a scream, a screech that only the true damned could ever muster, shriveling my poor, shrunken soul, reverberating through the halls of my mind. And then it lay still, the glow fading from its glaring yellow eyes once again. Cheated, banished back to whatever strange hell it had come from. Now Elizabeth was climbing to her feet. "The master!" she cried. "Oh, Lucas, what have you done to our son?" But I let her say no more. Grabbing her by the hair, I reached down and yanked the needles from our now-dead abomination and thrust them upward, under her chin, into the soft flesh of her throat. Her eyes widened, and she staggered back, gurgling and tugging at them, widening the wound till blood poured like a river down her body, mixing with the already blood-soaked floor, causing her to slip and fall, sending her crashing into a nearby dressmaker's dummy, which she clung to, trying to find her balance, but it was too late. Her legs gave way, and she dragged the thing down on top of her, pinning her beneath. As she convulsed and writhed, reaching out towards me, her fingers clutching, pleading, begging, but I turned my face from her. When I looked back, it was finally over. And so it's ended, and only I remain. I've written all through the long night. At last the sun rises, driving back the darkness. But it can never drive away the darkness within the stain upon my soul. I shall go to the cliff's edge now. I shall take my only son and heir with me. Together we shall travel through the dark waters. May God have mercy on our souls. Eric Michaels didn't like the dressmaker's dummy as soon as he laid eyes on it. Then again, he was already prepared to hate anything his wife Sarah brought home from the Vandraven house. If ever there was a haunted house, a truly haunted house, the Vandraven house was it. The site of both multiple murder and suicide. It sat overlooking the village like some broken idol for nearly 300 years. The place was cursed, damned, and Eric Michaels wanted nothing to do with it. And he sure as hell didn't want anything from the decrepit wreck in his home. But when Sarah had heard there was going to be an auction there, she had promptly lost her mind and immediately called up her friend Marcia, arranging to meet at the Vandraven estate promptly at 8 the following morning. Eric would well imagine them both sat outside the front gate like a couple of vultures, decked out in their best summer dresses, just waiting for the poor auctioneer to open the doors so they could sweep in, pick over the fallen carcass of the Vandraven house. In the end, she had returned with only 2 purchases, a dressmaker's dummy and a dusty set of crystal-cut wine glasses that Eric told her that he would never drink from. She had laughed at him then, calling him a superstitious fool before patting him fondly on the cheek and returning to the meticulous cleaning of her newfound treasures. Eric sighed and left her to it. It was all very well for her to call him a fool, but she was an out-of-towner from up-country, as the locals were fond of saying. Eric had been born and bred in Mavagezi. He had heard the stories passed on from generation to generation, had gathered in tents on many a Halloween night, and listened with terrified fascination as his friends and sometimes their older brothers told them gruesome stories of Lucas Vandraven, who had slaughtered his wife, unborn child, and even his new servants before throwing himself from a nearby cliff into the dark waters of the Atlantic. Stories of the Jonas family found dead in the basement of that house, their bodies twisted as if by some terrible force. She had never scurried past the house as a child, walking home alone from school as the sunset made the cracked and shattered windows burn with a seemingly evil intent. Yes, the Vandraven house was as much a part of the village as the fishing boats in the harbor and the summer people who came to visit every year. One day, he supposed, when the old place became decrepit enough, they would pull it down, and then all the evil things inside would rest. But for now, it still stood a monument to the madness, a madness that had now spread to his home. The first real argument started when Sarah moved the dressmaker's dummy into their bedroom. Eric had seen the god-awful thing stood in the corner of the large bay window next to Sarah's sewing machine, and had promptly flipped out. There was no way that he was getting even 1 minute's sleep with that ugly-looking thing looming over him, but Sarah was having none of it. The whole thing devolved into a shouting match where Eric threatened to sleep on the sofa till that damn thing was gone, and Sarah storming out, telling him that he was welcome to it. She had left him sat there on the bed fuming, wanting to scoop the fucking thing up and throw it down the stairs, but not quite daring to do so. Instead, he stood up and he slowly crossed the room, wondering what the hell she saw in something so ugly. The dummy was typical of its kind, legless, armless. It was nothing more than a headless torso impaled on a tarnished brass stand. The material covering the body looked to Eric like a light hessian, torn and ripped in many places. The overall feel of the thing was one of age and neglect. Curious now, he slid off the bed down to his knees and peered underneath, looking for a date or even a maker's mark. What he saw there caused him to recoil in horror. The underside of the thing was covered in a dark maroon stain that could only be blood. Old and dry, but blood nevertheless. The bottom of the thing was covered in it, drenched in it. Reaching out with a trembling hand, he touched the stains and was suddenly falling. The room spinning, disappearing as if he was being pulled down by some black tunnel. The room was gone, replaced by something else, somewhere else. All about him burnt candles, hundreds of candles and blood. There was blood everywhere. It lay in puddles upon the hardwood floor, ran in rivulets down the walls. Even the ceiling dripped with a crimson rain, splashing, hissing where it made contact with the flickering candles, filling the air with its choking scent. Reaching down with a hand that was no longer his own, he pulled 2 wooden knitting needles from the abomination that lay dead at his feet and span about. A woman was climbing to her feet, quite naked and covered in blood. "The master," she cried. "Oh, Lucas, what have you done to our son?" Again, that terrible hand reached out, grabbing the woman by the hair and thrusting the needles into the soft flesh of her throat. She staggered away, gurgling blood, gushing from her mouth as she tugged at the needle buried deep in her throat. Slipping, she cried out, grabbing a nearby dressmaker's dummy, clinging on for dear life, pulling it at her, raking it with her nails as she pulled it down on top of her, pinning her beneath. She reached out, begging, pleading, but he was going away now. Back into the blackness. Back to before, to now, to here. To this place. With a cry, he opened his eyes and yelled out in disgust. He was holding the dressmaker's dummy, holding it tight to his chest like some terrible dance partner. Thrusting it away, he backed up, trying to look everywhere at once. Dizzy, disoriented, he tripped over the corner of the bedroom rug, crashing to the floor, his head hitting the radiator with terrible force. The pain was blinding, turning his vision red, then mercifully he passed out into blackness. He awoke 2 days later with 14 stitches and a bad concussion. Sarah had found him unconscious on the bedroom floor, his head laying in a pool of his own blood, and had immediately called for an ambulance. He had only awoken once in the back of the ambulance as it rushed him towards St. Austell's General, but his words had been slurred and nonsensical, something about candles and blood before he passed out again. But now he was awake, doing well. His doctor had told him that he would be able to go to work at the end of the week, after a few days of observation. For the next few days, he lay there, the tedium only broken by meals and Sarah's frequent visits. At nighttime, he would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he was going to do about the dressmaker's dummy. There was no way that he could tell Sarah what had happened. She would think he had hit his head a little too hard. Besides, she would never believe him, and who could blame her? He barely believed it himself. He knew only one thing. The damn thing had to go, but how to get rid of it? That was the question. He was still pondering that same question on the night that they released him from the hospital. It was 7:30 at night, and Eric was standing outside the hospital entrance, doing his best not to obstruct the automatic sliding doors that kept opening and closing, much to the annoyance of the on-call duty nurse at reception, as he tried to take shelter from the pouring rain. Sarah should have been here to pick him up over an hour ago, but she hadn't shown up. Worried, Michael rang the house, but the phone was engaged. He tried 2 more times with the same results before trying her mobile, which rang for a couple of minutes, then cut to her answering machine. Eric had a sudden sense of foreboding, so strong that he actually became lightheaded and nearly dropped his mobile phone as he leaned heavily against the side of the building. After a few deep breaths, he quickly dialed the number of their good friend and neighbor, Helen Daniels. Thankfully, she answered on the second ring, and was more than happy to go knock on the door and see what Sarah was up to. No, Michael didn't mind waiting. Michael stood there, sweating and listening to the silence for what seemed like forever, but in less than 5 minutes, Helen was back telling him yes, the car was still there, and no one was answering the door, and yes, it was locked, and all the lights were on. Eric hung up on Helen before she could start asking questions and called for a taxi. Less than 10 minutes later, he was speeding towards home. Stepping out into a rain-soaked street, he paid the taxi driver and turned to face the house. Just like Helen had said, the car was still in the drive, and the house was lit up like a Christmas tree, with both the upstairs and the downstairs lights switched on. Feeling a little more relieved, Eric tried the front door, and finding it locked, just like Helen had said, he dug in his pocket and pulled out his keys. Stepping into the porch, he opened the door to the hall and suddenly stopped, his wife's name dying on his lips. The hall phone was hanging by its cord, gently swinging back and forth. Sarah's handbag was lying on the floor, its contents scattered and strewn all about the stairs. Jesus God, the stairs. The stairs were covered in blood. It was spattered all over the banister, slowly running down the wall in rivulets, soaking into the carpet beneath. Hitching hardly able to breathe, Michael staggered back into the porch and vomited noisily into the corner. He stayed that way, holding onto the wall, sweating, shivering, until his stomach stopped its twitching and heaving for a moment. He considered just leaving. No one could lose that much blood and survive, but if there was a chance, even a small one. He tried not to think as he ascended the stairs, feeling the blood squelch under his feet. On the landing was one of Sarah's shoes. It lay on its side and was filled with blood. Eric's nerve broke, then he turned to run, grabbing onto the sticky banner to stop him falling headlong into the stairs. He was only halfway down when he suddenly stopped, reeling backwards. There was a woman at the bottom of the stairs. She was naked and covered in blood, a gaping hole in her throat. Michael screamed as he recognized the woman from his terrible vision. He tried to move, to run away, but he was frozen, unable to move. The woman started up the stairs, her eyes glittering like black jewels from the deep sockets of her eyes. Michaels looked on in horror as she smiled up at him, revealing rotting teeth from which dark blood now began to ooze. Letting out a cry of terror, his paralysis broke and he turned, fleeing up the stairs, past the bedroom door, meaning to lock himself in the bathroom, but suddenly she appeared right in front of his face. "Our son!" she screamed, spattering his face with noxious blood. Terrified, half-blinded, he scrambled backwards, trying to wipe her vileness from his face. Screaming, she lunged forward, shoving him hard in the chest, sending him crashing through the bedroom door and onto the floor. His already battered head glanced off the bedroom table, and for a moment, the world darkened and he feared that he would pass out. Groaning, he raised himself up onto his elbows, trying to look everywhere at once, but the doorway was empty. Sobbing with relief, he clambered to his feet, ignoring the throbbing in his head. Suddenly, he was sure that she was behind him, ready to wrap her cold, dead hands around his throat, and with a cry, he spun around, his hands held high in a warding-off gesture, but the woman was not there. Only his wife, Sarah. For a moment, Eric Michaels was not sure what he was seeing. Then he began to laugh. The laughter turned into a scream, and the scream a shriek, as he clawed at his face, at his eyes, desperate not to see, yet unable to look away. The dressmaker's dummy stood in its usual place, but now a bloody, crumpled figure lay at its feet. Bone and sinew gleamed wetly under the merciful glare of the overhead light. The torn and battered body would have been unrecognizable except for Sarah's head, where it now sat atop the shoulders of the dressmaker's dummy. Her eyes rolled back to white, her blood-covered mouth wrenched open in a silent scream. The blood from the ragged stump of her neck ran down onto what was left of her tattered skin, which had now been stitched and sewn with crude stitches onto the dressmaker's dummy. As he looked on with horror, the whole thing began to vibrate. The empty arms starting to twist and turn, reaching out towards him. Still screaming, he started to back away. He heard laughter, then, not with his own ears, but echoing around the broken vaults of his mind. And suddenly realized Sarah's not poor dead lips were writhing, showing her bloody teeth. Her eyes now watched him, glaring at him as the vibrations grew stronger, getting closer and closer. The police found him there a few hours later. After an anonymous call, raving and ranting, his mind broken as he cradled the head of his poor, murdered wife in his arms. As for the dressmaker's dummy, there was no sign. In the Vandraven house, time did not stand still. It crawled and undulated. In the library, ancient books tumbled from wooden shelves. In the hall, the sound of booted heels scrabbled on the winding staircase. In the kitchen, An ear-piercing scream followed by breaking glass, then stillness. In the silence, a grandfather clock ticked, and the house waited, and waited, and waited. James Monroe slammed the phone down with a curse and headed straight for the fridge. Wrenching open the door, he stared at the ice-cold beer. His face contorted with anger. "Fuck it," he said, slamming closed the door and marching back into the living room. He stood in the middle of the room, his hands clenching and unclenching, with the need to lash out, to break something, anything. He stood that way for some time, his eyes closed, just breathing, until the anger passed and a great weariness fell over him, causing his legs to buckle, spilling him into a nearby chair. One beer, he thought, licking his dry lips. He'd do anything just for one goddamn beer. Yet he knew he couldn't do it. He had responsibilities. He had signed on with the NHS ambulance service at 8 o'clock that very morning, informing them that he was available as a first responder for the next 24 hours for Mavaghazi and the surrounding areas. A decision that he was now starting to regret. Talking to Marcia always left him feeling this way. Lonely, hollowed out, in dire need of a drink. God damn her. She had been nothing but a pain in his ass for the 10 years they'd been married, and would probably continue to be so for another 10 years to come. If it weren't for the kids, he would completely cut her loose. The divorce had been hard enough on the kids already. The mother using them like some kind of weapon. No, hostages. To be dragged out like bargaining chips for her ever-increasing demands. Just then the phone let out a shrill shriek, causing him to start from his chair. Angrily, he crossed the room and grabbed it up in mid-ring. "James Monroe," he answered, twisting the cord between his fingers. "Hello, James? This is Jane." There was no need for pleasantries or last names. James had been an emergency responder for over 15 years. He knew every dispatcher by name, if not by voice alone. "Hello, Jane," he responded. "What's your emergency?" For a second, there was silence. Then Jane began to babble. "I'm sorry, James," she said hurriedly, "but I need your help. There's been some kind of explosion at St. Ausley's Brewery. All available units have been dispatched to the scene. Half the town is on fire. Then I get this call—" Slow down, he said. "Take a breath. Tell me what happened." "Okay," she said, and James could almost see her pulling herself back together. "The call came in about 5 minutes ago. A woman screaming about blood, begging for help for an ambulance. Completely out of control. I just managed to get an address, then the phone went dead." "Jesus," James replied, leaning heavily against the wall. "Have the police been informed? You know we're not allowed to walk into any situation with unknown factors, or a possible crime scene. And besides, you know we only carry basic medical supplies. I have the defibrillator and oxygen, but they aren't going to be much good if someone's bleeding to death." I know, Jane replied quickly. "As for the law, Andy Clutterbuck is your local constable, has been informed and is on his way to the scene." "It's local then?" James asked. "Here in Mavaghazi?" she said. "Yes, up at the old Vandraven place," she said, sounding more frantic than ever. "James, please say that you'll help. The phones are ringing like crazy, and I'm here on my own." "Sure," James heard himself say. "Radio Clutterbuck and tell him I'm on my way." He hung up on her thank yous, but didn't move. His back pressed against the wall, his eyes tight shut. The Vandraven house. "Mother of God," he prayed. "Please don't let anything have happened up there again." Moments later, he was in his car. His medical bag quickly tossed in the back seat as he drove through the night-shrouded streets of Mavaghazi towards the old Vandraven place. Yes, old, James thought, as he headed up the school hill. The Vandraven house was old, all right. Built in 1836 by Lucas Vandraven, the house was both the site of suicide, multiple murders, and madness. Even the foundations of the house were stained with blood. In 1832, while the house was still under construction, 2 workers had died, one after falling from rain-soaked scaffolding and the other crushed to death by falling masonry. That had only been the beginning. Less than a year later, Lucas Vandraven had gone insane, slaughtering his servant, his wife, and unborn child before throwing himself from a nearby cliff into the cold embrace of the waiting Atlantic. The house had lain empty for nearly 20 years until it was purchased once again by Arthur Millington, a wealthy boatmaker who had retired in Mevagissey to spend his few remaining years by the sea. He had been found dead 4 months later, hanging from a ceiling beam in what had once been Lucas Vandraven's study. After him, the Dorchester family had moved into the house in 1910 and had promptly gone missing. The house had stood empty then for nearly 60 years, cursed and shunned by all, until the Jonas family moved in. The husband had been a painter and decorator who had holidayed in Mevagissey often and had finally decided to move down from Manchester to set up shop. He had seen the old Vandraven estate up for sale for an unbelievably small price and had immediately snatched it up, laughing at local superstitions and unconcerned by stories of its grisly past. He had moved his wife and 2 children right in and had started immediate renovations on the old place. At first, everything seemed to be going okay, and the village began to relax. Until the summer of '72, when the whole family was found dead in the basement, their bodies torn and twisted, as if by some terrible force. And now, over 40 years later, another family from out of town had settled in with dreams of renovating the old place back to its former glory. James drove through the night towards the very same house, spurred on by a cry for help and blood-fueled phone call. For a moment he slowed down, his own terror almost overwhelming him, but it was too late. He had already turned onto Beach Road, the Vandraven house looming before him as he came to an abrupt halt behind Andy Clutterbuck's clapped-out old Nissan Micra. He just sat there then, head down, taking one deep breath after another, trying to get his swirling emotions under control before clambering out of the car, grabbing up his med kit, and reluctantly turning to face the Vandraven place. The Vandraven house was more than a house. It was in fact a small mansion, set a little apart from the more modern houses of Beach Road, behind crumbling stone walls. It overlooked the dark waters of the Atlantic like some broken idol, a monument to both madness and murder. James started forward, squeezing through the rusted gates, and suddenly stopped. The front door was hanging wide open. The house was almost in complete darkness except for what seemed to be a small light burning somewhere in the back of the house. Slowly, he approached the front door, taking a small torch from his jacket pocket. He clicked it on and flashed it just inside the hallway. "Clutterbuck," he hissed. "You in there?" But there was nothing. Only the sighing of the wind and the rustle of autumn leaves. Laying down his bag, he flashed the torch up and down the rotten plaster walls, looking for a light switch, but found only a square hole with some new-looking wires poking through, and guessed correctly that the new family, the Malins, he believed they were called, were having the old place rewired as part of their ongoing restorations. Slowly, he picked up his bag, trying to ignore how the light in his hand trembled, throwing long shadows as he stepped inside. It was the smell that hit him first. The smell of decay, of rotting plaster, mildew, old black mold. He wondered how anyone in their right mind would bring their children to such a place. "Hello?" he called again. But there was still nothing, only the same waiting stillness. Creeping forward, he walked down the hall until it opened up into a large marble room with winding staircase that led up to an unseen balcony on the house's second floor. To his right was a large ornate wooden door from which a dim light burned beneath. With an arm that seemed to stretch for miles, he slowly pushed open the door. The room he stepped into was a complete contrast to what he had seen in the rest of the house. Here the walls were freshly plastered, The wooden floors swept and buffed down to a mirror shine with thick new rugs as a makeshift carpet. In the corner, rolled neatly away, were 4 sleeping bags, 2 large red and blue and 2 small, one pink with unicorns and another blue with Thomas the Tank Engine. By the boarded-up window was a mini DVD player and a 2-ring camping stove. And James surmised that the family were living out of this single room while the renovations were getting underway. "Hello?" he called, unnerved by the silence. "Is anyone home? Ambulance service." He was answered by a muffled groan coming from a so far unnoticed door. The noise came again, and he hurriedly flashed his torch around until he found the door and quickly pushed through, his fear forgotten as his medical training kicked in. The room he found himself in had at one time been a sort of kitchen or preparation area, and like the other room, was in the middle of being renovated. Some of the worktops and cupboards were brand new, but the walls were still covered in rotten plaster and broken kitchen tiles. James flashed his torch around, looking for someone in distress, perhaps slumped in a darkened corner. His light flashed across the floor, and he took a sharp intake of breath. There was blood here. A long smear of it leading to a small wooden door built into the back of the room that now stood slightly ajar. As James approached, he noticed a yellow flickering that caused small shadows to dance and undulate in the doorway. "Hello?" he croaked, his mouth suddenly dry, his tongue feeling large and swollen. "Ambulance service." He was on autopilot now, his legs carrying him forward as he pushed open the door, revealing the wooden steps slick with moss and cold earth walls running with moisture. He was halfway down when the smell hit him. A harsh, coppery smell like pennies, held too long in a tight fist. And suddenly his fear, which had sat like a cold stone in the pit of his stomach, overcame him. The flesh in his arms started to crawl as the hair on the back of his neck became erect, his whole body breaking out into great knots of goose flesh. He would have turned to flee, but his will was no longer his own. As he reached the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner, Andy Clusterbuck sat naked in the middle of the room, naked and covered in blood. He was surrounded by candles that cast dancing shadows all about him. As James watched on in horror, Clusterbuck raised a large carving knife and began to carve the skin from his face. He let out a sort of groan as he ground the tip of the blade under his eye and drew the knife downward, splitting his cheek, revealing the bone beneath. He saw James and grinned through bloody teeth. "He killed them," he said, pointing at the bodies all about him. "They tried to hide it from them, but he dug it out of them using this." He raised the bloody knife. "He told me a secret before he cut his own throat. He told me that there's something buried here, something that burrows and worms itself inside and hides, but I'll find it. You can help me find it," he said, driving the knife through his cheek. We can find it together." James turned then. His paralysis broken, he fled screaming up the steps, his bladder letting go as he screeched and gibbered, stumbling and falling through the Vandraven house, which now seemed to be coming to life all around him. From the shadows, faces loomed, some laughed, others screaming. Blood-curdling shrieks of agony echoed through the broken caverns of his mind, and somewhere, far away, a baby cried and a woman screamed her denial and terror. He burst through the front door, escaping the reaching shadows, and fled, stumbling into the night. Overhead, an uncaring moon sailed over the now silent Vandraven house. Inside, mice scurried through the walls. The floorboards creaked and dust motes stirred as if moved by some unseen presence. A grandfather clock chimed softly. And the house waited, and waited, and waited. Harry Saunders stared moodily into his pint, trying to figure out exactly when his life had gone down the crapper. Wasn't easy. Seemed for as long as he could remember, everything he touched turned to shit. Wasn't that he was an unpleasant kind of guy? Sure, he could get rowdy after a few drinks. There was that one time that he'd been caught stealing from some tourist from up country. But who gave a tin shit? It wasn't anyone from the village, just some rich prick, probably from London way. Some guy with a flashy car, a summer home in Barbados. What was the loss of one mobile phone to a rich prick like that? He'd been caught lifting the phone from the man's back pocket, but the thing that had really hurt was it had been one of his fellow villagers that had grassed him in. Old Maureen from the village fudge shop, calling out a warning in her old, warbling, cracked voice. The man had spun around, clamping a large, hairy hand on Harry's wrist. Harry had not tried to run or struggle to get away. What was the point? There must have been about 100 people milling about the village square that day, and he knew his goose was pretty much cooked. For that little stunt, he'd received a 500-pound fine and 100 hours of community service. That had been about 2 years ago now. He was still paying off the goddamn fine. At £2 a month, he figured he would just about be finished paying around the time Jesus returned to forgive him the sins of stealing in the first place. Fucking village. They hated the summer people just as much as he did. Behind their smiles was a smoldering contempt. But they hid it well. Desperate for the money those rich pricks brought down with them. They were like squirrels, storing their nuts to help them get through the long winters when the seas were high and the fishing lean. He was rudely dragged back from his musings by the clanging of the bar's bell. Big Eddie, the lantern's landlord, had called last orders and looked directly at Harry. He tipped his elbow a few times, the universal sign to drink up, and in Harry's case, to fuck off. Harry smirked and went back to contemplating the dregs of his pint. He knew damn well they had a lock-in at the lantern most nights. Old Eddie over there, he of the tipping elbow, would lock the doors, close the curtains, and keep the party going to the wee early hours of the morning. Of course, Harry wasn't invited. Not that it mattered. He had drunk away this month's welfare check at an alarming rate, and had just enough money left to keep the electric meter running until November's check arrived. Hot and crisp and rare to be drunk or smoked away. He stood, just about to leave. Then his old chum, Johnny Callum, came barging through the door, rubbing his hands briskly. He glanced over at Harry, then quickly hurried over to the bar, hoping to get a drink, but Big Eddie sent him packing with a wave of one meaty arm. Shrugging, he weaved his way over to Harry's table and plonked himself down. The smell of marijuana surrounded him like a cloud. "How's it going, Harry?" he grinned, the smile of the perpetually stoned. "All right," Harry said, squinting at his old friend, fellow black sheep, although it hadn't always been that way for poor old Johnny. He'd been someone once, a university graduate. He had studied in London and got himself a degree in the business studies. His mistake had been coming back to the village. He had planned to take a year off before hunting down a job in the big city, a little time to recuperate after the traumas of university life. So had returned to the peace and tranquility of his childhood home, only to run into his childhood friend, Harry Saunders, who had introduced him to the magical world of drugs and hard liquor. Now, just like Harry, he was a nobody. A well-educated nobody, but a nobody nonetheless. "Vandravens." "What?" Harry muttered. "I saw the Vandravens," Johnny repeated. "Jesus, Harry, how much have you had?" Harry waved that away. "What about the Vandraven house?" "I never said the house. There's nothing in that old place but broken furniture and bad dreams. Nothing we could sell anyway." "Sell?" Harry said, sitting up straighter, trying to clear away the fog. "Sell? What the hell are you talking about? This had better not be one of your get-rich-quick schemes. I don't fancy any more goddamn community service picking up litter and used needles. Once was enough." No, nothing like that," Johnny said, a strange gleam in his eye. "This is even better. You've heard of the Vandravens, Harry. You know their story." "Of course I do," Harry answered. growing somewhat impatient. "Everybody knows about the Vandraven house and the Westerfield family, found dead up there, bodies all torn up in the basement. It was the talk of the town when I was growing up. Never found the people responsible. Far as I know, the place has been empty ever since, so the old-timers say the place is cursed." "I'm quite sure it is," Johnny interrupted, "and was long before the Westerfield family ever moved in. Now tell me, Harry, what do you know of Lucas Vandraven?" Not much," Harry shrugged. "He was the man who built the house back sometime in the 1800s. Killed his wife, a whole bunch of servants before throwing himself off a nearby cliff. Ever since, the place is rumored to be haunted. Now, are you going to tell me what the hell the Vandraven house has to do with any of this?" "The house? Nothing. Lucas Vandraven? Everything. That and the place he was buried." Harry threw up his hands. "If you don't start making sense soon, Johnny, I'm going to punch you right in the nose. I swear to God." Okay. Johnny giggled, holding up a restraining hand. "But it won't make sense unless you tell it my way, and old Eddie over there is giving me the stink eyes. Come on, let's go to the ship. Helen's working on the bar tonight. I know she has the hots for me," he said, wiggling his eyebrows suggestively. That's disgusting." Harry grinned, clambering up to his feet. "She's old enough to be your mother." "Grandmother," Johnny laughed, also rising. "But what a set of tits." Laughing, both men left the lantern, Big Eddie's scowl following them out into the darkness. 10 minutes later, they were sat by a roaring fire in a quiet corner of the ship inn. Just like Johnny said, they had no problem getting served by the matronly barmaid, who seemed overjoyed to see Johnny and chattered away enthusiastically as she poured them both pints, making sure her ample bosom was on display the whole time. Finally, they escaped into a quiet corner and Johnny continued with his story. "You remember my grandmother?" "Of course," Harry replied. "We buried her only a few months ago. I mean, I was there at the funeral, wasn't I? Or have you forgotten?" Johnny ignored that. "What you didn't know was that her mother, my great-grandmother, used to work at the Vandraven house." "So?" Harry shrugged. "What does that got to do with anything?" "She was a maid. Cleaner used to go up there twice a week, clean the place, polish the silver, turn the rugs, that kind of thing. She was the first one to find them, or what was left of them, after Lucas Vandraven had finished with them." "Who?" Harry asked, showing the first real spark of interest. "Who did she find?" "His wife and her maid, all torn up on the sewing room floor. My old granny used to tell me tales when she had a few drinks, how her old mother had found them there, naked as babies, covered in blood, surrounded by black candles. His wife, Elizabeth Vandraven, she'd been stabbed to death with a pair of knitting needles to the throat. But it was her maid, Matilda, who got the worst. Her poor baby had been torn to shreds, where she lay on the floor, her stomach a red ruin, her blood spattered all over the walls. And later, when the house was more thoroughly inspected, there was talk of voodoo and bloody altars found in the basement, talk of human sacrifice, dark gods. Now, 2 days later, Lucas Vandraven's body was washed ashore, crushed to his chest, a child. Or at least something resembling one. But nothing normal, a freak, an aberration. Yet even in death, Lucas Vandraven clung to it. Both of them were hurried away and quickly buried in the Vandraven crypt in the ground of St. Peter's, and neither of them were ever spoken of again, at least not in polite society. My old grandmother was not a member of any aristocracy or polite society. She was common folk. She liked to talk, especially when the drink was upon her. She told how her mother had found the bodies, then ran screaming from that house like all the demons of hell were snapping at her heel. Now what she failed to mention, however, was her theft. Scared to death she was, yet the glint of gold had stopped her in her tracks. "Gold?" Harry said, leaning more fully forward, the light from the flickering fire casting shadows across his face. "What gold?" "A pocket watch, taken from Lucas Vandraven's study. Silver letter opener and a few other minor trifles. Whatever she could stuff in her apron pockets, I imagine." "Oh," Harry said, leaning back a little disappointed. "And this?" Harry said, reaching into his coat pocket and placing an old, tatty-looking leather-bound book on the table between them. What is it? He drained off the last of his pint while glancing over at the clock on the far wall. It was getting late, and to be honest, he was getting tired of the whole affair. It's his journal, Harry said, picking up the book and caressing it greedily. Well, part of it anyway. Talk about his adventures in faraway lands, or at least starts off that way. Second half is a list, an inventory of things brought from his old house in London to his new home here in Mavagezi. The Vandraven house, Harry said, interested once again despite himself. Yeah, Harry said, seeming to grow even more excited as he flicked to the back of the book, reading the very last page, before thrusting the book at Harry. There, on the last page. Do you see it? Harry did not need his old friend to point it out to him. The yellowed page contained a list written in Lucas Vandraven's large copperplate handwriting. The list was written completely in faded black ink, all except one word written in block capitals and in faded red ink. The word read, Necronomicon. What the hell is a Necronomicon? Harry asked, passing the old book back to Johnny. It's a book, Harry. Very rare book. One of a kind. Written over 1,000 years ago by a madman, poet named Abdul al-Hazad. Some say that he was possessed by the devil. The book contains dark rituals, writings on how to summon demons and other things beyond man's understanding. The book was banned all over the world before it disappeared completely. And you think that Lucas Vandraven had this book? Harry snorted. Yeah. He was a merchant seaman who owned a great fleet of ships that bartered and traded all over the world. Besides, it is written right there in his own journal, one Necronomicon. God knows if he knew what he had and whether it was connected to the deaths up at that old house. But Harry, don't you understand? If we could get our hands on it, it would make us rich beyond our wildest dreams. And you think it's here, Johnny? Harry laughed. Here, in this pissant little village, hidden away somewhere in that old house. No, Harry, I don't. I think it's in the Vandraven crypt. I think either the good folk of this village buried it with him to be rid of the evil, or he put it there himself to hide it from the rest of the world. And why do you think that? Harry asked, playing with his empty glass. Because of this, Johnny said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a piece of crumpled paper, which he unfolded and smoothed out across the table, revealing 3 rough sketches. Do you recognize any of these, Harry? Harry had a hard look at all 3 pictures. One was a book, the cover bound with what looked like a heavy leather with thick, rough stitching. The shape and pattern reminded him of a screaming man's face, or perhaps it was merely a trick of the light. The other 2 pictures were exactly the same, and Harry felt a familiar stirring at the sight of them. The first must be a picture of this Necronomicon thingy, Harry said, musing it over. The other 2 look familiar, but I ain't quite sure. You're right. This is a rough sketch of the Necronomicon. The other 2 are the coat of arms of the Vandraven family. One I sketched while looking at the statues of those god-awful lions that guard the porch of the house. The coat of arms is emblazoned across their chest, and the other one I sketched from the Vandraven crypt. See the difference, Harry? Harry looked hard. The Vandraven coat of arms was that of a 3-sailed clipper ship, riding a huge wave. An eagle's sword overhead, a struggling fish clasped firmly in its talons, or at least it was in one of the drawings. In the other, the eagle did not clasp a fish, but a book. A book that seemed to have a screaming face as a cover. Harry gasped. You found this one on his tomb, didn't you? Up there at his old crypt? Yeah, Johnny said, glancing around nervously at the nearly empty pub. For Christ's sake, don't keep your voice down, Harry. Sorry, Harry said, looking around guiltily before carrying on in a quieter tone. You really think it's up there, Johnny? Yeah, I do, Johnny said, leaning forward until their noses were almost touching. I think Lucas Vandraven built that crypt
Not only to be interred there one day, but also to hide his greatest treasures. God knows what could be buried up there, Harry. Not just the book, but gold, jewels. There has been talk of a pirate's treasure circulating around the village for years. God knows what a man like Lucas Vandraven got up to there at sea. So what do you think? Want to go take a look? Yes, Harry said immediately, his imagination soaring at the thoughts of such wealth. Good man, Johnny said, patting him on the shoulder. Now just don't you worry about a thing, Harry. I have a plan. Johnny's great and wonderful plan consisted of sneaking into his elderly mom and dad's garden shed to pick up a few rusty tools before storing them in the back of his equally rusted van. He then stole into the house, grabbed up a high-powered torch from under his sink, and a bottle of his dad's best brandy from the liquor cabinet. He thrust both into Harry's lap before gently turning on the ignition and pulling out of the drive, heading to St. Peter's Cemetery. Harry looked at his watch as they drove through the silent streets of Mevagissey. It was 1 a.m. Nobody stirring. Not even a mouse. What's that, Harry? Johnny asked, passing him the bottle. Nothing, Harry grunted, taking a long pull of brandy. Let's just get this done. Not having second thoughts, are you, Harry? No. Are you? Of course not, Johnny said, squirming under Harry's bloodshot gaze. Just all seems a little more real in the dark. Harry laughed, taking another long drink. He could feel the brandy warming him all the way to his toes. Old Johnny Callum, scared of the dark. Johnny didn't answer, just nodded his head at the window screen as he pulled his old van to a gentle stop before the cemetery gates. Here we are, he sighed. Yeah, I guess we are. You know, if we get caught, we could get in a lot of trouble for this. And who's gonna catch us? Johnny said, snatching the bottle from Harry and gulping the fiery brandy down. When was the last time you even saw a real policeman in Mevagissey? Oh, sure, we have that tosspot Andy Clutterbuck, but old Clutterfuck couldn't find his asshole with 2 hands and a flashlight. Come on, he said, climbing out of the van. In and out before you know it. Okay, Harry said, pulling his coat closed against the cold night air. Let's get this done. The first obstacle the two men came across was the cemetery gate. Harry had never known them to be locked. The cemetery itself had not been in use for at least 60 years, and dated back as far as the 1600s. People came here all the time to take charcoal rubbings of the old stones. Harry had even done it himself as a child, and had never seen the old gates so much as closed, never mind locked, but here he was looking at the world's oldest and rustiest padlock. Not to worry, Johnny said, fetching the tools from the back of the van. Have it all covered. That said, he picked out a pair of large-looking bolt cutters, somewhat shinier than the rest. Came prepared, did you? Harry said, shining the flashlight on the old rusty lock. Always best to do your homework, Johnny replied, bearing down, his back hunched. After a couple of seconds, there was an audible sink as the two blades came together and sheared the clasp in half, and sending the flaking old lock tumbling to the ground. There we go, Johnny said, kicking the lock to one side. Give me the flashlight, Harry. Follow me. I know where it is. Stay close. Place is in shite state. Bits of broken headstone all over the place. Vines, potholes in the path. Yeah, Harry replied, his breath steaming in the air. I've been here before, you know. That's the spirit, Harry, Johnny said, turning his back and heading into the darkness. Only a few more steps between us and a fortune. The cemetery was pretty much just how Harry had imagined it would be. Scary as hell. Everywhere there were little noises. The wind sighing through the trees, the rusting of autumn leaves, small creatures scurried away through the long grass, scared off by the human interlopers. Shadows cast by the faraway streetlights danced and crawled over the leaning, broken headstones, and stone angels seemed to turn to watch them as they passed. Suddenly, Johnny stopped, causing Harry to crash into the back of him, dropping the tool bag to the floor with a resounding crash. The fuck? Johnny rounded. You trying to wake up the whole fucking village? Well, if you hadn't just fucking stopped. Well, if you weren't breathing down my goddamn neck, how the hell am I supposed to see anything? Harry replied, scooping up the tools. You're the one with the goddamn flashlight. Okay. Let's not wake up the whole village. We're nearly there now. It's up here, he said once again, taking the lead. Just up past these trees." Harry had seen the Vandraven crypt before, but never in the dark. Now as Johnny played his torch over it, Harry seemed to remember every wild-eyed tale he'd ever been told of Lucas Vandraven and his terrible house. "Impressive, isn't it?" Johnny said, running a gloved hand down a white marble pillar. "I don't know what it is," Harry said, taking in the structure. "Looks like a mix between some old church and one of those Roman temples they always show on the History Channel." "It's too big," Johnny said, running his torchlight down the length of the building. "See how it runs back into the hillside there? So tell me, Harry, why would a man like Lucas Vandraven, with no living family, a man alone in the world except for his wife and a few servants, build a mausoleum as big as this?" "Because he was a rich prick," Harry snorted. "And even in death, he wanted people to know it. Or he's using it to hide something. Maybe a mix of things. And there's this. Look here, Harry. Just like I told you. Do you see it?" Harry came forward to the tomb's entrance, which was flanked on either side by tall, marble angels. Each one carried an upraised sword, and the crest of Vandraven was blazoned across their shields. "Do you see it, Harry?" Johnny said excitedly. "Do you see it?" "I see it," Harry replied. "Just like you said. A book clasped in eagle's claws, not a fish like up at the house." "It's here, Harry. I bet my life upon it." "You may well have to," Harry replied roughly, handing him the bolt cutters. "If there's nothing in there, I'm going to have to bash your skull in with this spade and leave you here. After all, it's plenty of space." Johnny laughed nervously and set about breaking off the old padlock from the thick wrought iron gates. He needn't have bothered. He barely touched the thing when it fell off to the floor in a shower of rust. "Well, that was easy," Johnny shrugged. "Now comes the hard part. What do you think that door is made of, Harry? It's like copper. Thick, too. You certainly don't have a key to that lock." "Let me guess," Harry said. "You brought your lock-picking set?" "Even better," Harry said, taking the tool bag off Harry and placing it on the ground. He rummaged through it for a moment before climbing to his feet, a portable butane torch in his hand. "Holy shit, what the hell are you going to do with that thing?" "Melt through the lock, of course. Copper's a soft metal. Shouldn't take long to soften the metal. Then we just give it a knock with a good old hammer and should pop right out." "Just like that," Harry said doubtfully. "Have a little faith in your old pal," Johnny said, kneeling down. He popped the flame on his lighter, then turned on the gas, and immediately a sharp blue flame sprang to life. Still smiling, he began to cut. The whole thing took a hell of a lot longer than Johnny had said. Copper may be soft, but it doesn't melt easy. After 2 hours of heating, then banging at the lock with a lump hammer, wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, the lock finally gave way. By this point, both men were sweating profusely despite the cold, and Harry kept looking at his watch worrifully. It was now 3 o'clock in the morning. The effects of last night's booze were wearing off, and he was beginning to wonder what the hell he was doing up here in the first place. "Okay," Johnny said, gathering up the tools. "Let's finish this. Help me with the door, Harry." Together, both men put their shoulders to the heavy door and pushed. It gave way grudgingly with a loud creak that made both men wince and quickly look around before darting inside. What they saw inside stopped them in their tracks as their torchlight revealed the chaos within. Everywhere, there was broken stone and rotting plaster. In the corner was the remnants of a shattered coffin, a few bones scattered here and there. Johnny continued to slowly play his torchlight around the tomb, his mouth hanging open. In the center of the room lay another coffin. This one also had been smashed open, its contents heaved out onto the floor. A skeleton lay close by, dressed in the remains of a tattered dress. The skull was whole and surrounded by long, wispy hair. Long, drained of any color. It seemed to grin at them as if happy to see someone after so long alone in the dark. "Mother of God," Harry whispered. "Look there," he said, pointing at the back wall. Johnny dragged his eyes away from the grinning skull and shined his light where Harry's trembling finger was now pointed. "What the hell?" he gasped, not believing what he was seeing. At the back of the crypt was a huge hole. The concrete had somehow been blasted away, leaving a ragged hole surrounded by crumbling dirt and poking roots. "Son of a bitch," Johnny growled. "They stole it." "Who stole what?" Harry said, scurrying to keep up. "Grave robbers. Sons of bitches must have tunneled their way in and stolen everything inside." He suddenly came to an abrupt stop, his anger evaporating as shock took over him. He turned to look at Harry. "Look," he whispered, shining the torch with one trembling hand. Harry quickly looked over his shoulder. "Holy shit," he said. "What the hell's going on here, Johnny?" "I don't know," Johnny replied, staring at the stone steps that led down into the darkness. "I don't have a fucking clue." A full minute passed until either man spoke again. They just stood there trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "Okay," Johnny said, squaring his shoulders. "Let's head on down." "What?" Harry said, grabbing Johnny's arm. "What the hell are you talking about?" Johnny shrugged free and shined his torch in Harry's face. "I'm gonna go down to take a look. There's something hidden down there, Harry, and I intend to find it. Look at those steps. No grave robber built those, don't you get it? He hid it away, buried it down there maybe in some kind of cave complex he discovered while building the foundation for this place. It's down there, Harry. The Vandraven fortune. We can split it, Harry. You take the gold, the jewels, whatever we find. I take the book. Come on, Harry. We're close, can't you feel it?" And he could. There was something down there, almost as if it were calling to him. Perhaps his entire life had led to this moment. All of his failures left behind him. He'd be rich. Richer than his wildest dreams. And then he would show them who was a loser. He could see it now, them begging him for money, and the village girls who had snubbed him, calling him a waster. He could have them. He could have it all. And what was there to be afraid of? This is no Indiana Jones movie with a bunch of cheap booby traps. There was nothing down there but the dark and a fortune just waiting for Harry Saunders to go claim it. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." They had only been walking a few minutes, seemingly heading straight down, when the floor suddenly seemed to level off, forming a kind of tunnel. They staggered on the walls, getting narrower, their breathing loud in their ears. Harry was just about to demand to go back when they turned a final corner that opened into a small cave. Harry looked around in amazement. His jaw dropped as he let out a terrified groan. The cave was lit by some kind of glowing fungus that seemed to crawl and undulate with a strange life of its own. Strewn across the floor was the wealth of nations. Gold, doubloons, pearls, and jewels the size of hen's eggs. Rough bars of silver and gold trinkets lay scattered about. Amongst all these treasures, an obsidian altar rose in the center of the room. Upon it lay a large black book. It could only be the fabled Necronomicon. "Sweet God," Johnny muttered. "It's here, Harry. We actually found it." "No," Harry shouted, lurching at his friend. He span him about. "We have to leave this place, Johnny. We have to leave right now. Can't you feel it? This place is evil. We have to leave," he said again, half dragging his friend with him. "Leave?" Johnny shrugged him off angrily. "It's here, Harry. The book's right here. You can have the rest. Take it all. But the book's mine." "Help me." The voice was nothing more than a sibilant whisper, yet both men slowly turned in the direction from which it had come. With a trembling hand, Johnny raised the torch and shined it on the back of the cavern-like room. There, slumped in a throne-like chair, sat a man, a creature that had once been a man. The thing wore the remains of a tattered suit, torn from the waist up. Clinging to its rotting frame was some kind of loathsome leech or parasite. As the two men looked on in horror, the thing tore a strip of rotting flesh from the creature's side, revealing yellowed ribs. Black blood oozed from the opening, and the creature let out a cry of agony as it stumbled to its feet, reaching out, imploring the two men. "Help me," it pleaded. "Help me feed it. It's hungry. Always hungry. Help me feed it. Help me feed my son." "No!" Harry screamed in denial.
Turning, he fled into the darkened passage, Johnny right behind him. Even over Johnny's whimpering, Harry could hear it coming, hear it dragging its rotting body after them, trapped forever in its own version of hell. They were halfway up the stairs when there came a clattering from behind and a cry of pain. Harry spun around. Johnny was down, sprawled on the steps, his face a grimace of pain. My ankle! Oh, God, Harry, don't leave me here! A pale arm shot out of the darkness and wrapped itself around Johnny's throat as the thing that had once been Lucas Vandraven pulled itself up onto his body, and for a moment, Johnny heaved and bucked, gagging and choking. Then his eyes rolled up in his head as he fainted dead away. Now there was only Harry, face to face with his terror from the dark. He scrambled backwards as the thing reached for him. Come with me, it chuckled. Down into the dark. Such things I will show you. Such sweet agonies. Come, it said, reaching, straining. You will live forever. No! Harry screamed, scrambling to his feet. He turned and ran, bursting from the tunnels. He ran through the night-shrouded crypt out into the night. He fled, screaming, his mind broken. In the graveyard, all was still. An owl hooted in the wind, sighed through the trees. Overhead, a pale moon shone a silver light over the now silent tomb of Vandraven. Shit! Jason Burnett shouted, sticking his thumb into his mouth. He had been working on a particularly nasty blackberry patch when a large hand had fallen heavily on his shoulder, causing him to jerk in surprise and rake his hands amongst the waiting thorns. He turned, meaning to rain down curses on the offending person, but the words died on his lips, and he saw to whom the offending hand belonged to. Jason didn't know the man by name, but he had seen him strolling about the tattered tents and rusting caravans that had suddenly appeared with the coming of the gypsies. He wasn't exactly hard to miss. The man must have stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a mane of flowing black hair streaked with silver. He wore a large gold hoop on his left ear, but it was the scars that the eyes were the most drawn to. The man's face was a mass of scars, the worst running from the top of his forehead all the way past the empty socket of his left eye and petering at the bottom of his stubble-covered chin. It was this terrible wound that Jason Burnett was trying to drag his eyes away from when the man began to speak. "We've come to help you with your festival," he said, in a strange accent, revealing broken, blackened teeth. Jason winced, trying not to recoil at the reek of the stale tobacco washing over him. "You mean Feast Week?" he replied, somewhat bemused. "Yeah," the man said, flashing his rotten teeth. "Just so, we have come to help you with your Feast Week." "Sorry, it's volunteers only, and we can't pay you for your trouble." At this, the other man straightened, his bushy eyebrows crushing together. "Did I mention money, town man? Also, there is mistrust between men from town and the traveling folk. I offer help only to show goodwill and to thank you for letting us stay, if only for a little while." Jason, who was head of the village committee and who was working furiously with local authorities to roust the gypsies out of the village before the start of Feast Week, could only smile weakly and offer a none-too-sincere apology. "Sorry, friend," he said, holding up a restraining hand. "Not too many people, even here in the village, want to do such tiresome labors on a hot Sunday, and especially for free, so you understand my misgivings." "Of course," the big man smiled, taking a step back. Jason noticed, however, the man's smile never quite reached his eyes, and he realized in that moment that not only did he dislike this man, but feared him a little too. "So it's decided," he continued, holding out a large, nicotine-stained hand. Jason reached for the hand, but was grasped by the forearm instead. "My name is Radek Lulpine. I'm king amongst the traveling folk." For a moment, Jason was tempted to bow and call the other man Your Majesty, but considered it unwise and simply introduced himself as Jason Burnett. His mind was racing now, a mile a minute. It was already late May, and the tourists had started a slow but steady trickle into the village. The last thing that Jason and the rest of the village council needed was a bunch of gypsies hanging around the village, or stinking up the harbor with its picturesque lighthouse and outstanding views of St. Austell Bay. Luckily, they had decided to camp in the back fields of School Hill, far from the center of the village, which gave Jason Burnett an idea. There was a coastal path nearby, leading from Mavagizzy to nearby Pentawan. At this time of year, the path would be overgrown with nettles, brambles, and tall wild grasses. He would put the gypsies to work clearing that path. This would serve two purposes. One, it would keep them close to their own encampment, and two, it would keep them busy just long enough for Jason to convince the local authorities to roust them out of the village. Smiling, Jason took the other man's arm. "Let's talk." It was early the following evening as Jason was enjoying a well-deserved pint after a busy day of erecting flags and laying bunting, when John Stampton barged into the lantern. He didn't look about, he just hurried across the room to where Jason sat at the bar. His face was flushed, and Jason noticed the other man's shirt was drenched with sweat, as if he'd come on the run. "What's the matter?" he asked, turning on his bar stool to more readily face the other man. For a moment, John Stampton said nothing, but just stood there, puffing and panting, as he tried to catch his breath. His first words, however, turned Jason's blood cold. "The Vandraven house." "What about it?" Jason asked, hopping off his stool. "I saw them hanging around there." "What?" Jason exclaimed a little too loudly before grasping the other man's shoulder and hustling him outside. "What the fuck are they doing up there, and why didn't you move them along?" "I didn't feel like I had the right," John squirmed. "You're part of the village council, John, same as me, and you know it." "I know it," Jason said, not quite able to meet the other man's eyes, "and I ain't afraid of a few gypsies, if that's what you're thinking. It's that damn house, Jason. I ain't going anywhere near that place." Jason sighed. "All right, John. I'll go up there and I'll take care of it, but don't go shooting your mouth off. The last thing I need is people from the village getting wind that these people are rummaging around up there." "Okay, Jason," the other man said, almost fawningly as Jason turned and headed up the hill. "But we need to get them away from that house," he called after him, "before anything else happens to them." Jason didn't turn. He just raised a hand in solitude and headed on his way. 10 minutes later, he was heading down Beach Road past the well-kept houses towards the coastal path. The Vandraven house was at the end of the row, a little apart from the rest of the houses, a large manor estate surrounded by its own grounds. It sat facing the cold waters of the Atlantic like some dark sentinel from another time. Built in 1831 by Lucas Vandraven, the house was a place of murder, suicide, and madness. A dark blot, a stain on the village, cursed and shunned by all, and now the goddamn gypsies were mooching around the place. Jason had just hoped and prayed that they hadn't somehow managed to find a way inside, because he sure as hell wasn't gonna go in after them. He was here now, just passing the old place, when he heard voices coming from around the back of the house that bordered on the coastal path. He hurried on a little faster, listening intently. There were voices, all right, coming from a crumbling piece of wall that led into the Vandraven grounds, and one of them was definitely the voice of a small child. That decided him. The Vandraven estate was no place for children, or anybody else for that matter. Cursing, he boosted himself onto the wall and just stopped, his mouth agape. Part of the gardens had been completely cleared away, stood out in stark contrast to the overgrown trees, thorn bushes, and general neglect of the rest of the grounds. Jason was just about to hop down and march over to where a group of the gypsies stood, gathered about, their backs towards him, when Radic Lupine suddenly appeared in front of him like some evil jack-in-the-box. "My friend!" he exclaimed, leaping on the wall, driving Jason backwards. He would have taken a nasty tumble if Radic hadn't landed beside him, gripping his shoulder in one massive arm. Jason shook the other man off angrily, stepping away. He straightened his shirt with quick, angry jerks. "The hell are you doing in here?" he demanded, his anger overriding his fear of the bigger man. "What you asked us to do," Radic replied, ignoring the anger in the other man's voice. "See," he said, walking quickly towards Jason, both arms outstretched. Jason had no choice but to retreat further down the path away from the Vandraven house. "Look," Radic said, nodding over Jason's shoulder. Jason turned reluctantly and glanced down the path, but quickly turned back.
Very good, he said, not so easily distracted. Yes, Radek beamed. My people have been working very hard. You didn't answer my question, Jason interrupted. What are you doing at the Vandraven house?
Radek sighed as if bored with the whole conversation.
My friend, what harm has been done?
Yes, I know that perhaps this place is the private property, but
it is old and long abandoned. The grounds were a mess and clearly visible along the path from behind the crumbling walls. So I told my people to clean the place a little so that you will see how hard the people of Radek work for your village, yes? Tell me, my friend, how have we offended you?
Jason felt his anger evaporate, leaving him feeling small and petty. The gypsies had done a damn fine job of clearing the path so far, and what they had done to the Vandraven grounds had been almost fucking miraculous. It was the house. The goddamn house. It got under your skin, into your psyche, and Jason began to wonder if madness was catching.
I'm sorry, Radek, he said, offering a sincere apology. But you shouldn't be in that place. It's dangerous. The house is old, and many bad things have happened there.
A sudden voice piped up from behind the old stone wall, speaking in a language that Jason didn't understand. Radek's reaction was immediate as he scurried to the wall, leaving Jason hanging in mid-conversation. He reached down behind the wall and scooped up a little girl. Jason guessed her age to be no older than 7 or 8. She had flowing white hair, and her eyes were covered with a filthy-looking bandage. Nevertheless, when Radek placed her gently on the ground, she moved with a speed and grace that belied any form of handicap.
Is the child blind? Jason asked, as he watched her hurry away.
Yes, Radek replied, his chest swelling with pride. Even the least of Radek's people is a good worker, but it is of no mind. We look after our own, as we always have. You were saying about the house, is it dangerous? I'm thinking you mean old. How is it you say? Unstable? It will collapse all about us?
Yes,
Jason seized upon the idea. It was as good an explanation as any, and a damn sight easier to explain. Yes, he said again, peering up at the old house.
This place is very old, should have been condemned many years ago, and besides, you've cleared the part of the grounds that can be seen from the path. No need to endanger your people any further.
Quite right, Radek replied, turning back to the wall. He let out 2 sharp whistles, almost immediately, as if they had been poised there all along. The other gypsies began to scramble over the wall, an assortment of rusty-looking tools slung over their shoulders. Radek spat something at them in the same musical language the little girl had spoken, and they hurried on a little faster. Radek waited until the last man was over, then patted Jason on the shoulder and swiftly walked away. Jason stood there and watched him go, before heading back to the village, trying hard not to glance at the Vandraven house as he passed. Still, he felt buried in its shadow as he hurried away. The next 2 days passed in a blur of committee meetings, hurried phone calls, and long hours of general preparation as feast week loomed ever closer. Jason had just gotten off the phone and was contemplating a nice warm bath when there came a loud knock at the door. With a sigh, he crossed the hall and reluctantly opened it. John Stampton stood there, the setting sun blazing behind him, lending him an almost ethereal quality. Jason had not seen John since that day in the lantern, but here he was again, and Jason had the sinking feeling that he was here with more bad news. "They're up there again," he blurted. "Old Mary Fairweather saw them as she was walking her dogs alongside the coastal path. Heard them. Singing. Carousing like they were having some kind of party up there." "Son of a bitch," Jason exclaimed, slamming the door behind him. "I told them to stay the fuck out of there." John was just about to reply when Jason turned on him, grabbed him by the arm. "You're coming with me this time, John. You're just as much a committee member as I am. Maybe they'll listen to you. They sure as shit aren't listening to me." Okay, ease up, Jason, for Christ's sake. I'm coming along, ain't I?" John said, shaking free. Jason let him go, mumbling and cursing to himself as the other man fell in beside him, sullenly rubbing his wrists. Neither man spoke to the other until they had traversed the harbor, cresting School Hill, and hit Beach Road. There they stopped, watching as the sun began its slow descent into the sea, lending the Vandraven house a kind of blood-hue glow. "Let's get this done," Jason said, squaring his shoulders. "I don't want to be anywhere near this place in the dark." "So what's the plan?" John asked in a small voice. Jason Burnett was his friend, and the man had a big heart, but it was best to tread carefully around him when his temper was up. "I'll tell you what I'm going to do," he said, setting off at a pace. "I'm going to tell them to get the fuck out of here. That smooth-talking son of a bitch lied to me." "Okay," John said, hurrying to keep up, "but maybe best not to go in there screaming and shouting. Hey, Jason, we don't want to upset anybody." The thought of shouting and screaming at Radic Lupine made his balls feel tight and uncomfortable. If Jason heard him, he gave no sign, just kept going on with his head down, muttering to himself. He was tired and pissed off. He could do without all the extra hassle. He would tell Lupine to get the hell off the grounds and threaten him with the law if he ever came back. Enough was enough. The shadows had just started to seriously lengthen by the time they arrived at the crumbling section of the wall, where Radic's party had last entered the Vandraven grounds. And once again, Jason could hear voices coming from the other side. He was just about to start clambering over when two burly-looking gypsies suddenly emerged from the shadows. They were both big men, not as big as Radic Lupine, but far from small fry either, and for some reason, they were both wearing rather unpleasant smiles. Smiles that Jason Burnett felt very uncomfortable with. He was just about to ask where the heck Radic was when a large fist came crashing out of the darkness, and he went away for a little while. He didn't come out of the darkness gradually, but snapped awake, the sounds of screaming piercing the dark veil of unconsciousness. He tried to stand, to focus, but was dragged back down into a seated position, his arms cruelly twisted up his back. It was nearly full dark now, and the Vandraven estate was lit by flickering torches. In front of him played out a scene from a man's worst nightmare. John Stampton was being dragged toward some kind of stone altar. No, that was wrong. Not an altar, but a chair. A kind of stone throne that sat facing the ocean. The last rays of the setting sun blazing across the cold waters. The poor man was stark naked and covered in blood. Runic-like symbols had been carved into his quivering flesh. He screamed again, the terrified shriek of a trapped animal, but the gypsies, dragging him along, only laughed at his feeble efforts to escape. Jason, seeing his friend's fate, began to struggle, but was held easily in place by his captor's enormous strength. He only realized it was Radic himself who held him captive when the man began to whisper in his ear. "Now you'll see something, town men. A ceremony that has not been held for 1,000 years. "Why are you doing this?" Jason stammered. "Because it needs to be done. Once this place was ours and belonged to our people, a sacred place. But that was before the Romans came with their false gods and their scattered people, burning our sacred places, and then, after them, the disciplines of a lamb god, Jesus, who killed our priest and converted the people with their lies, their false promises of heaven, until only a few of our sacred places remained. This was one of those places, or at least it was until that monstrosity was built," he said, nodding towards the Vandraven house. "Our oracle tells us that the sacred stones that once sanctified this place were destroyed, crushed, used in the very foundations of that terrible house, and you wonder why it's cursed," he snorted. But Jason barely heard a word. He only had his eyes for the tableau unfolding before him. Jason Stampton was mercifully passed into unconsciousness. This seemed to bother the surrounding people not one bit, as they flung his bleeding body onto the crumbling throne and secured his hands and feet to its ruined frame with bits of rope and frayed twine. "See, she comes," Radic hissed from behind him, just as a small girl appeared from the shadows. She stood alone, dressed in a pure white robe. The stark white bandages wrapped around her eyes shone like a halo around her head, and Jason instantly recognized her as the blind girl that he had seen move with such eerie grace only a couple of days before. As he watched on, the girl savagely ripped the bandage from her face, and the surrounding people gave out a collective sigh. Jason, however, began to scream. He screamed long and loud until cursing Radek managed to stuff a sweat-stained rag deep into his mouth. "Silence, town man," he hissed. "Your time to scream will come soon enough." But Jason couldn't help it. The girl's face was terrifyingly alien. Both of her eyes were white with cataracts except for the third, which sat in the middle of her forehead just above the bridge of her nose. This eye was black and pupilless, and as Jason watched on, his muffled screams ignored, it began to ooze blood that ran down the girl's pale face like crimson tears. "Radek," the girl snapped. "Bring me the knife." Radek quickly signaled to another man, and for just a split second, Jason was free before another strong pair of hands clamped down on him. Radek, meanwhile, had scurried across the clearing and was down on one knee, offering up the sacrificial knife to the waiting girl, who took it from him reverently, chanting in her small voice until the rest of the people joined in, defiling the night with her guttural singing as if offering up a prayer to the gibbous moon that now sailed overhead. As the girl approached the stone chair, the chanting increased, becoming wild and untamed. Some of the people began to convulse, lost in the ecstasy of the moment. Others fell to their knees, tears openly running down their faces. The girl raised her hand and the crowd fell, immediately silent. She was up on the chair now, standing on the seat between John's splayed legs, knife poised above his throat. She muttered something, an incantation, or perhaps some kind of prayer. Either way, the moment the words left her lips, John's eyes flew open. He had time for one last terrible scream before she brought the knife flashing down, slashing him deep across the throat, rupturing arteries and tearing through sinew. Blood began to spurt, and she flung herself backwards onto Radek's waiting arms. She immediately struggled free and fell to her knees, taking up her terrible chanting once again. Jason felt his bladder let go as the chair began to vibrate, and then smoke, and eventually the stone started to melt, run and crawl adherently into John's poor dead body, dissolving him, eating him, making a part of the whole until he was completely gone. And the chair sat there, renewed and revitalized. The girl stood, bloody knife in hand, and the cultists went wild, cheering and surging forward and falling at her feet. As she approached the swaying Jason, the lumbering Radek, cursing and kicking the baying mob out of her way, stood proudly by her side. Jason struggled, eyes going wide with terror as he saw the bloody knife still clenched in her small fist. She followed his gaze and smiled. "Do not worry, town man. This knife is not for you, though you will find its bite many times before the night is through. At times, you'll wish for death, even beg for it, for pain is as much a sacrifice as death." "Radek," she said, handing him the bloody knife. "Shall we begin?" The sun was just starting to stain the night sky when Jason Burnett was placed upon the throne. He had endured hours of torture at the hands of his captors, but just like the girl had said, he had begged them to kill him, and they carved the ancient runes and symbols of the summoning into his bleeding flesh. At one point, he had began to ram the back of his head into the ground, desperate to escape the pain, but the cultists had held him in place with ropes and strong bonds, ignoring his pleas. He had screamed and begged for help, but no one had come. The night was eerily silent, as if some kind of spell had been cast over the whole village. The night went on and on, perhaps 100 years, maybe 1,000, until at last it was over. And he lay a bloody heap on the great throne, the sea stretching out before him as infinite as the sky. By his side stood the girl, her robes stained with his blood. Before her stood Radek, knife in hand. At some unseen signal, he took up a place behind her as she knelt in the dirt, facing the sea. She began to chant, her voice booming, bouncing off the nearby cliffs as she took Jason's hand, their fingers intertwining, her cries becoming frantic, now pleading, now beckoning. In front of them, the dark waters of the Atlantic began to heave and stir. The girl let out a scream of triumph, raising their entwined hands into the air. This was the sign that Radek had been waiting for. And without a moment's hesitation, he plunged the sacred knife through the girl's neck, killing her instantly before turning the knife upon himself. Jason could feel himself slipping away now. Blood loss and shock taking him down into the blessed death. The last thing his faded vision beheld was a huge monolith rising from the sea. Something clung to its side, something unspeakable, something reaching towards him. He found the strength for one last scream before darkness drew him under. In the pre-dawn light, a figure arose from the stone chair. Its skin was flawless, and it wore the face of Jason Burnett. It stood facing the Vandraven house for some time as the sun rose in the east. It stepped into the house's shadow, and then disappeared inside.
Good evening once again, kids. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or for listening to tonight's episode of the podcast that's available on Spotify, or on Apple Music, or on any other places that you can get podcasts. If you guys have loved any of the series you've been hearing on the channel, such as the Neverglade Mysteries, My Tiny Town Has Just Been Put on Lockdown, or Tales from the Gas Station, and you've wondered if there's more, there is. Take a look on Amazon. All these authors and many more have books available on Amazon right now, and some of them I've even done the audiobooks for. Check them out now, see if you can pick up a novel or two, and let them know that I sent you. As always, I want to give a big thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon. You guys are the real MVPs, and you allow us to get a whole bunch of custom stories that are only heard here on this channel, on this podcast. So, a very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Bobby Karman, Tristan Pelton, Chase Burnett, Diana Kraus, Maria Walker, Tonya Oran, Paingravy, Inactive Hermit, Austin Johnson, Crazy Kid, MrMarcusBlitz, Aika Limchoc, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Jabbles Raz, Voiceofsand, Coffee Zombie, Matthew McNeese, ChellyJay, Jeremy H, raltizal, PhycoMel, Nana, TheMorrigan, Nick Weaver, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, Sky Maria Ravenswood, William King, Reaper 61167, Darth Miver, Micah Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Nessie, Parafa Panda, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Billy Morrow, Sashi Suzaku, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Miss Xander, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades' Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trey Smiles, and Corey Kenshin. And of course, everybody who's down there in the description as well, and everybody who can support on patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta for even $1. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for listening, and sweet dreams.